The unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Describing the Indescribable is a wonderful Dharma book about the Diamond Sutra. It's got a commentary by Master Sing Young, and it's translated by Tom Graham. And it's actually one of my favorite Dharma books. I have read it several times over the last year or two. And I've been thinking for months of doing a Dharma talk on it. The commentary is so lucid and so deep, and I find it a most helpful book. I don't understand it all. There are many things I go, I don't know that one. And yet I find it enormously helpful. So when I was out at recently, I decided, okay, I'm going to do this Dharma talk on the Diamond Sutra. And then last week, and there was this terrible incident that occurred with an Afro-American man named George Floyd, who was killed by a police officer. He was unarmed. He was drunk, but not harmful, not trying to threaten the police particularly, but just disruptive. And the policeman knelt on his neck for 9 minutes and he died. And so this was like a match to gasoline. There have been riots, unfortunately, in some areas, looting, but lots and lots of demonstrations. A lot of upheaval in our country. And it still came up to do this Dharma talk on describing the indescribable. However, the interesting thing for me is that what came up very clearly for me is anger and the transformation of anger, because I've been working on this for many years. When I was a young teenager, President John Kennedy was assassinated. And then when I was in high school, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, Robert Kennedy, and also Martin Luther King. And when I went to college, the first 2 years at the university, there were riots, student protests. I saw students being beaten. I went to hear what people had to say at a demonstration and was tear gassed and chased. And it was a lot of upheaval, very difficult time, very contentious time. And I had a contentious family. And then I later married a wonderful person who was a great arguer. And I became a great arguer. I probably was a great arguer. So I spent all this time in this upheaval of not getting along, of contentiousness. So I think our country learned a little bit from those times, and conditions got a little better, but as we all know, not enough, and for some people, and also, people are afraid right now. People are afraid of being killed, like George Floyd, without just because of hatred and anger and violence. So it's my hope that our nation will find wise ways of helping beings. And what goes on in the world is profoundly impacted by what goes on within us. So, so that's the nature of this talk. That's why I'm doing this talk, is because we have to look at our own disputatiousness, our own anger, and pull it in. I would like to read a quote. I wasn't sure I could get it in, but it fits so perfectly to this part. It's a poem, 27 verses of mind transformation, which is what this Dharma talk is. Hopefully you'll say, oh yeah, mind, transforming the mind. And it's written by a Tibetan Lama. I cannot pronounce his name probably correctly, but it's Je Tsongkhapa, the great Dharma king of the three realms in the 14th century. And one of his verses says, and that you'll see why this applies, I think, so sensitive an ecology is the interdependence of all, that the slightest attention and assistance to others, the slightest attention of assistance and attention and assistance to others creates moral elevation for ourselves and humanity, whilst the slightest indifference or neglect towards others creates moral harms for ourselves and our civilization. The faintest spark of ill will towards other beings can burst forth into a terrible forest fire, consuming vast expanses of sympathetic joy. Even the faintest negative reaction or malicious wish opens wide channels throughout our entire being for life-destroying poisons of negation and life-obscuring shadows of self-cherishing. This is what my Dharma talk is about, hopefully. You will be able to see that. So, let's talk a little bit about what anger does. It arises in response to injustice. It arises in response to hate or judgment from others. And it can occur to us personally if our family or our friends are being treated unfairly. It can arise if our fellow practitioners are being treated unfairly or are being abused. It arises in the most intimate ways for us, from one group to another, from one country to another, from one individual to another. Anger and hate causes war, and in its worst, it justifies genocide, murder, and destruction of others. I was thinking about it in terms of my personal life. I've been on this planet 70 years, and there were, in those 70 years, it was 5 years after World War II, where all 6 million Jews were killed. I spent much of my life trying to understand how this could happen. And then, there was Rwanda, Cambodia. There's all these places where genocide has occurred because of anger. And so this is an opportunity for us to turn away from our own anger and to heal it and to let it convert into love, truthfully. No matter how angry on an individual level, no matter how angry someone may be at us, if we respond with anger, then we are at fault. We are responsible for our anger, for our own response. The Buddha said, I think it was in the Avatamsaka that I read it, but I think he also said it elsewhere in the Pali Canon. Even if someone comes to dismember your every joint, if you spout hot words of anger, you are not in control of your mind. I myself find that a very inspiring thing to think about, but I don't think I'm there yet. So I'm really working on it because it's a ways away. So I'm going to talk about transforming and healing our own anger. And why am I talking about that? Because I think it'll help our nation. Because that quote I read about when we choose to do the right thing, it helps everybody. So who's angry? Well, if we argue, if we speak against others, if we judge others, if we belittle others, if we think ill, even if we're just thinking these thoughts, that is anger, and that is unconverted. This is the opportunity for us. To transform anger, we have to see it. We have to see what it causes, not only why we get hooked by it, but what consequences there are to ourselves and others. We really have to own it. When we meditate, we learn over time that there is this little space between thoughts, between actions. And that little space is actually our refuge. And when we take a moment to bite back, to, it isn't suppress the anger. We see the anger. We let it burn in the body. But we don't pour the gasoline. We don't add wood to the fire. We just sit still. And that's how it begins to get cleansed and transformed. And really, this process is actually quite beneficial to us. Hard to do, but very beneficial. The Dalai Lama says in his book, Healing Anger, The Power of Patience from a Buddhist Perspective, he says, one's pain is one's own creation. One will see that because of the very act of harm, one is given the opportunity to practice patience and tolerance. So from our point of view, this is the Dalai Lama still talking, our point of view, I assume, is the Buddhist perspective. It's an opportune moment, and we should feel gratitude towards the person who does harm. Well, that's a pretty radical view, especially in what's going on. But it's good to think about that. Can I be grateful to this person who is being difficult for me and helping me learn to be patient? So, where does the Diamond Sutra come into this? If you read the Diamond Sutra, you know that anger is not directly mentioned. So why am I talking about anger in relation to the Diamond Sutra? Bear with me. Because years ago, our monastery translator, Reverend Master Hubert, talked about that we're to pay close attention to the scripture we're studying. He said, pay attention to the Bodhisattva, our ancestor, who is asking questions of the Buddha. He said that's a very important point because it works on the assumption that you know what this ancestor or Bodhisattva, what their qualities are, and so what they have to offer in relation to the scripture. So the questioner for the Diamond Sutra is Savuti. And who is Savuti? Who is this monk, Savuti? What do we know of him? His name translates as good, that's what Su is, Su. Existence, which is Buddhi, good existence. That would be a nice thing to be said of one's life. There are few details of his life. However, there is I'm going to give you a summary of some of the story from Disciples of the Buddha, which was edited by Zeno Ishigami. And one of the things Savuti said, he quotes Savuti, what he said as an elder monk when he was quite old. He said, "My true abode is the secure house of knowledge that all things in the universe are insubstantial, homogeneous, and equal." Insubstantial, homogeneous, and equal. I've thought about that a long time. Believe me, I didn't understand it. I probably still don't understand it. Insubstantial. What he mean by insubstantial? I think part of what he's pointing to is that what Reverend Master Ju said in her Lotus Blossom Kensho, nothing matters. It's that willingness to let go of everything. We cannot hold on to anything. And homogeneous and equal, to me, is talking about the Buddha nature, that we all have Buddha nature. We are all equal in the Buddha nature. Some of us have it more covered up than others, but that doesn't mean they have less than anybody else. And there's this incredible equality. And my experience with the Buddha himself, having read numerous stories in the Dhammapada, is that his equanimity to male, to female, to low caste, to high caste, he was completely equanimous in how he responded to people, which is an incredible gift. And it's still going on, that gift. So what about Savuti? When he was a young child, he was beautiful, he was so gentle, everybody loved him. And then at a period of time, and his parents took great care and effort with him, but after a while, he developed this thing that was very hard for everyone to deal with. And he became steeped in ill will and toxic speech. And by the time he was a young man, everyone, even his family, avoided him because he was so difficult to be around. He was so angry all the time. He threw stones and cursed the birds in the sky. He was one raging human being. One day he ran away and he went into the forest alone, and he got further and further into it. And then he met an old man who queried why he was there. And he said, well, my father, scolded me and made me so angry I ran away from home. And the old man said to him, being angry without doing any good will only increase your suffering. I hope you can relate to these things as what's going on in today, too. The old man recommended Savuti go and ask and listen to the Buddha's teaching. And so he did. And as soon as he saw the Buddha, saw his countenance, it was like a load released off him, and he decided, I'm going to become a monk. So after the Dharma talk, he went up and asked to be admitted. And the Buddha looked at him, and the Buddha said, and I'm going to quote a lot from the Buddha, short temper is clearly written on your face. There is no room for irritability in the discipline of a monk's life. You must have patience and forbearance. Do you think you can develop these traits? Savuti was silent. The Buddha continued, if you're constantly angry, without trying to alter your mental attitude, evil will increase day by day until finally the sea of goodness will disappear. An irascible person's anger makes them suffer the torments of hell, since they are constantly poisoning their own mind with venom that leads to fault-finding and killings. They shut themselves up in their own suffering, and until ultimately they are unable to find a way out of it. Well, this Dharma so profoundly impacted Savuti that he repented. He just fell at the Buddha's feet and repented. And so the Buddha let him become a monk. But he spent a lot of time teaching him. And one of the things he said after he had given him a lot of teaching was he said, failure to keep to these teachings arises from attachment to one's own being. And this is the origin of all conflict. I'm going to read that again because I think that's really important for all of us. Failure to keep to these teachings arises from attachment to one's own being. And this is the origin of all conflict. All conflict. So severing all attachment to his own being which took him time, but he did it, Savuti achieved selflessness and was called the Buddha's disciple, called by the Buddha his disciple foremost in the understanding of the doctrine of emptiness. So this is why Savuti actually brings anger and the letting go of oneself, selfishness, to the Diamond Sutra, because the Diamond Sutra is about, it's a wisdom teaching, it's about emptiness, but emptiness comes by overcoming our fetters. It doesn't just happen to us. We have to work at it. And that's why Savuti is the speaker for the Diamond Sutra, and that's why he's so important. So, if someone had said to me that when I became a monk that anger and disputatiousness was written across my face, it would have been true. I got a lot of teachings that helped me work on my anger. And one of the things that I found enormously helpful in working on my anger was no self. And believe me, I didn't understand what no self meant, but I understood what selfishness meant. And I could see where I was being selfish. And so I worked on that. And letting go of my view, my will, just being able to see the me in my struggles with resentments and discontent. So what I'm trying to say is that no self is not something I understand necessarily, but that I just kept working on owning my anger and being responsible for it, and looking at my selfishness and being responsible for it. And that there's this beautiful quote on the 10 nourishing attitudes in the scripture of Brahman's Net, where they say, patient spiritual progress and true emptiness of self are the same. And that kind of sums up. We just work on our practice, we work on ourselves, and that is the expression of no self. Now, recently I was going along and I couldn't figure out, there were habitual patterns of anger that were not going away, even though I was working on it and kept letting go and letting go. And when I was meditating, I asked for help. And what came up was the Eightfold Path. So I went to How to Grow a Lotus Blossom and Reverend Master Jiva's description of the Eightfold Path. And the thing before right thought, which is what I was trying to work on, was right understanding. I'm just going to read for a moment from How to Grow a Lotus Blossom by Reverend Master Jiva. This right understanding is the root of the lotus blossom, that from which the rest of the plant springs, that which enables the blossom to remain unwetted and unstained by the water that surrounds it, whilst its roots remain in the mud. The roots of the lotus are nurtured in the mud of right understanding, as right understanding can be nurtured in this world of delusion if only we use everything, including adversity, as the opportunity rather than an impediment to our training. Without those dark years, there could have been no end to suffering, no finding of its cause, no certain knowledge of suffering's existence. So it's the right thought is the shift in our perspective. Instead of these things dragging us down or being hard for us, they become an opportunity. Instead of people driving you crazy, and of course anger is crazy, it's so much better to say, oh, I'm being given an opportunity to practice patience. This is not easy. This is not easy for any of us. But we watch our mind and we say, oh, isn't that interesting? Look at how upset you are about something. Does it really matter? We query ourselves. We challenge ourselves. We learn not to divide ourselves and others. So, finally, we come to the Diamond Sutra, although we've been talking about it all along. So I wanted to read a couple of lines that are extremely helpful to me in terms of this question of anger. And the first line that I find really important is from there are many lines. This is one of the many lines that are really important to me. So, it's the Buddha talking to Savuti. And it's chapter 4, the wonder of behaving without attachment. Moreover, Savuti, within this phenomenal world, a bodhisattva ought to practice generosity without basing it on anything. This means that he or she should not base their generosity on form, and they should not base their generosity on sound, smell, taste, touch, or thought. So emptiness begins in behaving without attachment and allowing perceptual truth to flow through us rather than us taking charge of situations. It's not about me being generous or me being good. It's really about behaving without attachment. Well, that actually is attainable. We can do that. We can practice that. That's not so hard. We just let go. We just let go over and over again. We just, instead of thinking, oh, I'm doing this, you see that I'm me, and you do it. You let go. It's not easy, and yet it is easy. If we're trying to deal with our anger, and we're trying to get the self out of the way, then we have to keep our mouth shut. Wait a while. We watch our minds. We release our negative actions and reactions. And we come back to it over and over again. So this learning to behave without attachments really is not just talking about generosity. It's talking about the purification of karma. How do we purify our karma? And being generous is part of the ways we purify our karma, because it's good to give, and it's more than that. We have to practice. So in the commentary, Master Xing says, generosity and patience are two sides of the same coin. Generosity looks towards the good of others, while patience does not recoil from their evil. I love that. Does not recoil from their evil. That's really helpful to me, because anger is a recoiling from the conditions of our life that we're adverse to. Oof. And patience is our antidote. Another line I wish to talk about, which has been really helpful in my life, was I first came upon reading the Diamond Sutra when Reverend Master Daishin gave his retreat on it in the early 2000s. I don't remember when, but it was 2003 or something like that. Anyway, it was early in my monastic life. Maybe it was later in my monastic life. But anyway, he did a retreat, and I came upon the line, all lakshanas are delusive. If you can see that all lakshanas are not lakshanas, then you will see Tathagata. I had no idea what that line meant, but something in me said, this is really important. So I wrote down that line, I put it on my desk, I taped it to a part of my desk, and I looked at it every day. And it took me a while to understand what it means. And what lakshanas are. Lakshanas are diluted awareness. It's our thoughts, our perceptions, our memories, our emotions, our dreams, or any other element of our awareness. So what is this line? Why is this line so important? And I think why I feel this line is so important, because it is saying, let go of the things as you see them, as you think things are. Let go of that. And when you let go of that, then you open yourself up to Buddha nature. And you can see the Buddha nature. You can see the Buddha nature in others. You can see the Buddha nature in the situation. You can just let go of the way we see things and open to what's really going on. And that, to me, is why it is such an important line. Because we can always practice that. We can always come back to that, letting go of what we think is going on, and just open to the situation. I think I'm supposed to end with this. And I feel like I've left something out in my Dharma talk, but it must not be. So I'd like to end because with this the last chapter of the Diamond Sutra, the last verse. He says, the Buddha, this is the Buddha talking, and he says, how should this sutra be taught to people? By not grasping lakshana, by remaining immobile, and I think that means stillness, by remaining still in this consciousness. So we remain still, and then we see all conditioned dharmas, and conditioned dharmas is with a little d. It means all things. It's not the Dharma of the Buddha's teaching, that's a capital D, but the little d is all things that we see, all conditioned things, all things that arise, abide, and pass. All conditioned dharmas are like dreams, like illusions, like bubbles, like shadows, like dew, like lightning, and all of them should be contemplated in this way. And that, I think, is what we can offer to other beings, and convert our own anger and help others convert theirs, because it is possible. And that's a great hope. So thank you. Thank you all.